Anybody here? How many continental congresses were there? Two main continental congresses. After the ratification of the Articles, the Second Continental Congress evolved into the Congress of the Confederation, which is sometimes considered a third iteration. It was technically the first federal government under a new governmental structure. Hello, viewer. Hi, chat. I am. Can you not hear me? Okay, cool. Cool beans. Okay. So it's a little laggy. Can you see the chat? Yes, you can. Cool. Oh, hello, viewer number 2. Who else have we got in chat? We'll start here. U.S. National Guard troops in Washington to begin carrying weapons, officials say. Some National Guard units in Washington, D.C. have started carrying firearms with handguns and rifles under strict rules for use of force. President Trump is considering expanding the military deployments to other Democratic-led cities like Baltimore, Chicago, and New York. I read somewhere today that they're going to be sending to 19 different states. And 19 states. Fox News? Up to 1,700 National Guardsmen are set to mobilize in 19 states in the coming weeks to assist the DHS with Trump's nationwide crackdown on illegal immigration and crime. Pentagon officials confirmed to Fox News. Documents obtained by Fox News show planning for activations in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, Ohio, South Carolina, South Dakota, Texas, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, and Wyoming. Florida, which with status effective from August through mid-November. Texas is projected to host the most significant Guard presence. National Guard soldiers are being mobilized will effectively serve as a support pillar to a sweeping federal interagency effort while also serving as a visible deterrent force. Service members supporting ICE will be performing case management, transportation, logistical support, and clerical functions associated with the processing of illegal migrants at the facilities. The in-and-out processing may include personal data collection, fingerprinting, DNA swabbing, and photographing of personnel in ICE custody. Jesus. Fewer than 2% of the authorized forces have mobilized so far, but missions coordinated under state governors are projected to expand in the coming weeks, including in Virginia, where approximately 60 soldiers and airmen will begin training August 25th to begin duty by early September. Virginia National Guard personnel will not conduct law enforcement functions, and Virginia National Guard support will not include making arrests, a spokesperson for the VNG told Fox News. Soldiers and airmen will report directly to ICE leadership at their assigned duty locations, but remain under the control and direction of the Virginia Governor and Adjutant General of Virginia. Under the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, use of the military for civilian law enforcement is limited, but the National Guardsmen will be mobilizing under Title 32, Section 502F authority, to which Posse Comitatus does not apply. At the request of DHS in July, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth approved hundreds of additional forces for DHS ICE interior enforcement support and switched existing approvals from Title 10 to Title 32 status. 32 U.S. Code 502. Under regulations to be prescribed by the Secretary of the Army or Secretary of the Air Force, as the case may be, a member of the National Guard may, without his consent, but with the pay and allowances provided by law, or with his consent, either with or without pay and allowances, be ordered to perform training or other duty in addition to that prescribed under subsection A. The training or duty ordered to be performed under paragraph 1 may include the following: support of operations or missions undertaken by the member's unit at the request of the President or Secretary of Defense. B. Support of training operations and training missions assigned in whole or in part to the National Guard by the Secretary concerned, but only to the extent that such training missions and training operations are performed in the United States or the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico or possessions of the United States, and are only to instruct active duty military, foreign military, under the same authorities and restrictions applicable to active duty troops, Department of Defense contractor personnel, or Department of Defense civil employees. Duty without pay shall be considered for all purposes as if it were duty with pay. Not quite sure what this all looks like. Training stuff. I'm not sure what the National Guardsmen will be mobilizing under Title 32, Section 502F, but that all seems to... Oh, F. A, B, C, D, E, F. Be ordered to perform training or other duty in addition to that prescribed under subsection A. A reads, under regulations to be prescribed by the Secretary of the Army or the Secretary of the Air Force, as the case may be, each company, battery, squadron, or detachment of the National Guard, unless excused by the Secretary concerned, shall assemble for drill and instruction, participate in training encampments, maneuvers, outdoor target practice, or other exercise at least 15 days a year. So in addition to all that stuff, they may be ordered to perform training or other duty. That seems like what authority they're going with for that. Very high factuality. The Times-Union Some National Guard units in Washington start carrying firearms as Trump threatens additional cities with deployments. Oh, I guess there's no article. It's just a sound. I don't want to listen. I want to read. The Hindu. U.S. media reported on August 23rd the Guard will begin carrying firearms in Washington, citing defense officials. Oh, man. Where are the free articles? U.S. National Guard troops in Washington to begin carrying weapons, officials say. U.S. National Guard troops patrolling the streets of Washington, D.C. are, as part of what President Trump said was his crackdown on crime, will begin carrying weapons on Sunday night, two officials said. The exact number of troops who would carry their weapons was fluid, but they will either carry their M17 pistols or M4 rifles, according to the officials who spoke on condition of anonymity, as they were not authorized to discuss the matter. Hundreds of unarmed National Guard troops have been in Washington streets for the last 2 weeks after Trump declared a crime emergency in the district, which, by the way, Washington, D.C. crime stats was the highest in, 20 years in 2023, but then came back down. I need a graph. Yeah, it hits a 30-year low this year. But he uses the stat from 2023 to justify the crime emergency in D.C. Homicides. 2017, we had 116. Then 160 the following year, 166, 198, 226, 203, 274 in 2023. And then last year there were 187 back down. And this year I think it's gone down as well. Yep. Here's the homicide rate in DC. This is, like everywhere else in the country, I think, 1987, with a peak in 91, and then it slowly dropped over the ensuing years. This graph doesn't go all the way up to 2023, but there was a spike. There's no labels on this graph. What is that, 80 per 1,000 people? I don't know. Yeah. The Guard's Joint Task Force DC said in a written statement on Sunday that its personnel would only use force, quote, as a last resort and solely in response to an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Meanwhile, Trump, a Republican, has said he would probably expand his crime crackdown to Chicago. I think he said that on Friday, intervening in another city governed by Democrats. And on Sunday, he suggested the possibility of deploying troops to Democratic-run Baltimore in Maryland. Democratic House of Representatives Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said on Sunday that Trump did not have the authority to deploy troops to Chicago as the Pentagon carried out initial planning for a possible deployment. U.S. officials, speaking on the condition of anonymity, said there had been initial planning at the Pentagon about what a deployment of National Guard troops to Chicago would look like. One official said the plans were part of the military's efforts to anticipate any requests by Trump, and noted senior Pentagon officials have not yet been briefed on them. It's not uncommon for the Pentagon to plan for potential deployments before formal orders are given. Jeffries said any move to deploy troops to Chicago was an attempt by Trump to manufacture a crisis. crime, including murders, has declined in Chicago in the last year. There's no basis, no authority for Donald Trump to potentially try to drop federal troops into the city of Chicago, Jeffries told CNN's State of the Union on Sunday. Jeffries cited comments made by J.B. Pritzker, the Democratic governor of Illinois, which includes Chicago, who said there was no emergency warranting the deployment of the National Guard or other military. Leveling criticism at Democratic Governor Wes Moore over crime levels in Baltimore, Trump said he was prepared to deploy troops there, too. In July, the Baltimore Police Department said there had been a double-digit reduction in gun violence compared to the previous year. The city has had 84 homicides so far this year, the fewest in over 50 years, according to the mayor. If Wes Moore needs help, I will send in the troops, which is being done in nearby D.C., and quickly clean up the crime, Trump said on Truth Social on Sunday. Man, Trump's writing is as hard to read as Hamilton's, but for an entirely different reason. Some Republican governors have sent hundreds of National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. at Trump's request. The president has depicted the Capitol as being in the grip of a crime wave, although official data shows crime is down in the city. On Sunday, Trump asserted without evidence that there was now no crime in the city and credited it to his deployment of troops and hundreds of federal law enforcement personnel. Trump has much less power over Chicago and Baltimore than he does over D.C., where as president he holds more sway. Title 10 of the U.S. Code, a federal law that outlines the role of the U.S. Armed Forces, includes a provision allowing the president to deploy National Guard units to repel an invasion, to suppress a rebellion, or to allow the president to execute the law. Trump cited this provision, known as Section 12406, when he sent National Guard units to California earlier this year to counter protests over the objections of Governor Gavin Newsom. In the case of Chicago, which is a so-called sanctuary city, Trump may argue local laws that bar city officials from cooperating with federal immigration agents prevent the president from executing the law, justifying the military presence. Trump is almost certain to face legal challenges if he uses Section 12406 to send National Guard troops from Republican-led states into Democratic strongholds. Bill Maher makes bold admission about Donald Trump's marijuana reclassification push. Bill Maher admitted that he agrees with President Trump's push to reclassify marijuana from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3 drug. Sure. What's a Schedule 3? I mean, descheduling would be best, right? But Schedule 3 drugs are substances that have a moderate potential for abuse and dependence, but less than Schedule 2. Examples of Schedule 3 equals anabolic steroids, buprenorphine, butyrine, codeine, hydrocortisone, LSA, tramadol. Schedule 3? I don't know if I trust that. Let's go to the DEA's website. Schedule 1. Schedule 1 drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Examples of Schedule 1 are heroin, LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, methaqualone, and peyote. Schedule 2 drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with a high potential for abuse, with use potentially leading to severe psychological or physical dependence. These drugs are considered dangerous. Some examples of these are combination products with less than 15 milligrams of hydrocodone per dosage unit, such as Vicodin, cocaine, methamphetamine, methadone, hydromorphone, Dilaudid, Demerol, OxyContin, fentanyl, Adderall, Ritalin. Schedule 3 drugs are defined as drugs with a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. Examples are products containing less than 90 milligrams of codeine per dosage unit, ketamine, anabolic steroids, testosterone. Schedule 4. Well, weed has always been Schedule 1, I think. Since the 80s or 90s or whenever that was. Let's see. When scheduled as 1. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 the federal government categorized marijuana as a Schedule 1 substance. So yeah, since 1970 it's been Schedule 1, which is fucked up, honestly. It should never have been Schedule 1. I mean, maybe I could understand Schedule 3 here, moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. I've definitely seen people withdraw off of marijuana before. I mean, it's nowhere near withdrawal from something like heroin, but it does suck. Okay, wait, this doesn't make sense. Schedule 4 drugs are defined as drugs with low potential for abuse and low risk of dependence, such as Xanax. I thought Xanax was very easy to abuse. Xanax, Soma, Darvon, Darvocet, Valium, Ativan, Talwin, Ambien, Tramadol. Like, all of this seems rather arbitrary. I feel like Xanax should probably be a Schedule 2. Whereas, like, testosterone should probably be like a Schedule 4 or 5. Because, like, as far as I'm aware, you can stop taking testosterone and you'll probably be okay. Like, it doesn't give you a high, does it? Schedule 5 drugs are defined as drugs with lower potential for abuse than 4 and consist of preparations containing limited quantities of certain narcotics. Schedule 5 drugs are generally used for antidiarrheal, antitussive, and analgesic properties. Examples are cough preparations with less than 200 milligrams of codeine per 100 milliliters, like Robitussin AC, Lomotil, Modafin, Lyrica, Parapictolin. Yeah, this scheduling system seems a little arbitrary, gonna be honest. Rights for big guys, yeah. Anyway, I don't know what this bold admission is. That, I mean, descheduling would probably be the best. So maybe it's a bold admission that he doesn't want to deschedule, but he'd rather just reschedule it. Trump held a news conference on August 11th confirming his administration's desire to reschedule marijuana, saying they will make a determination over the next few weeks. It means we won't hear another thing about it. Trump said of marijuana, I've heard great things having to do with medical, and I've had bad things having to do with just about everything else. Yeah, sure. I mean, putting it down to 3 would be better than nothing, I guess. U.S. heat wave smothers Pacific Northwest, poses extreme risk in California and Arizona. About 1.2 million people were under extreme heat risk, with dangerously high temperatures expected to stay high overnight. Largest area under extreme heat warning was found around Tucson, Arizona, with forecast highs between 102 and 170 degrees Fahrenheit. In Portland, at least one runner lost consciousness during a relay race due to the heat, with the highest heat risk of 2025 forecast for the area. Record high temperatures, wildfire risk to states across the West. More than 30 million people are under extreme weather alerts Sunday. Excessive heat warnings and watches were effective in parts of California, Oregon, Washington, and the desert Southwest, with temperatures soaring well into triple-digit territory around Phoenix and approaching record highs near Seattle. Wonderful. Prolonged period of warm temperatures will begin tomorrow and continue into at least next week, the National Weather Service in Seattle said on Thursday, adding that temperatures would near daily records across northwestern Washington. Temperatures measured at the Seattle-Tacoma Airport tied a daily all-time high on Friday evening And measurements in several nearby cities either tied or broke records between Friday and Saturday, according to the Seattle Forecast Office. James Webb Telescope finds 300 ancient galaxies that defy cosmic rules. Ooh. A University of Missouri team just used JWST infrared imaging to identify 300 unusually bright objects that may be early galaxies in deep space. Oh, space. News about space. Researchers applied the dropout technique in spectroscopy to detect these candidates, but additional confirmations are needed to confirm their nature. One object has been confirmed as an early galaxy through spectroscopy, and many bright objects challenge existing galaxy formation theories from the early universe. Haojing Yan stated that even confirming a few early galaxies would force modifications on current models, noting the discovery could shift the cosmic timeline. These findings imply galaxies might have formed earlier than thought, potentially altering the understanding of the universe's first stars and large-scale structure. That's fucking cool. "300 objects shining more brightly than expected." That's cool, yeah. So our current theories on the formation of the early universe does not predict galaxies this far away. So if these are galaxies this far away, that means we have to rethink our models. And that's where the real science happens. I think we might pause on Federalist paper and just continue reading the other thing for a little while. Original meanings. Okay. The second great issue of foreign relations concerned the peace treaty itself. Article 4 of the Treaty of Paris, the treaty between Great Britain and the burgeoning United States, the newly freed United States, provided that creditors on either side shall meet with no lawful impediment to the recovery of debts previously contracted in good faith. Under Article 5, Congress was required to recommend that the states similarly permit British subjects and American loyalists to sue for the recovery of confiscated property. Both articles placed Congress in the awkward position of guaranteeing what it lacked the constitutional authority to deliver: the compliance of state legislatures and courts with a national commitment made to a foreign... put Congress in the awkward position of guaranteeing what it lacked the constitutional authority to deliver, which was the compliance of state legislatures and courts with a national commitment made to a foreign power. When individual states violated these clauses, Britain used their non-compliance as a pretext for retaining the northwestern forts, Oswego, Niagara, and Detroit. retaining the northwestern forts whose surrender had also been part of the Treaty of Peace. This, in turn, further jeopardized congressional plans for the national domain, since a continued British presence in the Northwest encouraged the hostile Western tribes to resist encroachments on their lands. Where's Oswego? And also, this Detroit they're referring to is like the same Detroit that we have, and Niagara. Old Fort Niagara. A fort at the mouth of the Niagara. Okay. So, in New York, on the United States side, right at the head of the Niagara River, is Old Fort Niagara. And then the falls are over here. Okay, that's cool. Fort Detroit. Fort Detroit. It was a French and later British fort. In the city of Detroit. That makes sense. Because you never know. Sometimes these places are named and they're 1,000 miles away from the other place that has the same name. Okay. And I guess Fort Oswego. Oswego, New York. Now called Fort Ontario. Okay. Okay. Whoa. Okay. Pretext for retaining the northwestern forts, whose surrender had also been part of the Treaty of Peace. This, in turn, further jeopardized congressional plans for the national domain, since a continued British presence in the Northwest encouraged the hostile Western tribes to resist encroachments on their lands. The future of westward expansion was also implicated in the third major post-war problem of foreign policy. In April 1784, Spain closed New Orleans in the lower Mississippi River to American navigation. Thus preventing frontier settlers living west of the mountain barrier from shipping their produce to the Gulf of Mexico and thence to other markets. Prevented. Did Spain own New Orleans? Or was New Orleans a Spanish thing? I thought it was a French thing. Louisiana, New Spain. They received it from France in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. Was a province of New Spain from 1762 to 1801. Okay. From when to when? From 1762 to 1801. This action, coupled with abortive separatist movements in Kentucky and what would become Tennessee, would threatened to deprive the United States of the generous territorial settlement accorded by the Treaty of Paris. Should the weakness of the Union force Western settlers to accommodate themselves to Spain, control of the regions lying between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi would be lost to the United States. Where are the Appalachian Mountains? Okay. Appalachia. Furthermore, because the region below the Ohio was commonly viewed as an outpost of southern expansion, acquiescence in the Spanish action threatened to exacerbate sectional tensions within Congress. New Orleans, it burned down and then the Spanish rebuilt it. Oh, yeah, I remember that. The New Orleans fire or something? No, not fire department. 1788? The Great New Orleans Fire. There was another great fire in 1794. A lot of fires. Southern leaders grew particularly outraged in 1786 when Secretary John Jay went so far as to propose that the United States abjure its navigational rights in exchange for a commercial treaty with Spain. Jay's proposal evoked a sharp and bitter sectional division within Congress, giving sudden validity to vague speculations that the United States might eventually devolve into 2 or 3 regional confederacies. While the revenue plan of April 1783 made sluggish progress through the state assemblies and Congress pursued its efforts to organize the national domain, these concerns of foreign policy dominated efforts to strengthen the Confederation. Proposals for reform developed along 2 lines. One involved clarifying the authority that might be presumed already to lie in Congress by virtue of its general power to make treaties with foreign nations. Here, the great challenge was to establish the principle that national obligations should prevail over the legislative acts of sovereign states. Thus, in his seminal decision in Rutgers versus Waddington, James Duane set an important precedent for both the supremacy of federal treaties over state law and the judicial review of legislative acts. The other avenue of reform centered on enhancing federal power in an area where experience indicated that the national interest required that Congress be given what it currently lacked, the greater authority to regulate both foreign and interstate commerce. In 1784, Congress did submit new amendments asking the states for limited authority over foreign commerce. In 1785 and 86, it considered committee reports proposing additional powers in the same area, and in September 1786, the Annapolis Convention met to ponder the same issue. All of these, the Annapolis Convention. All of these proposals foundered on the requirements of unanimous state ratification. Floundered? Really? On the requirements of unanimous state ratification. In practice, the height of that constitutional hurdle discouraged those who supported a stronger confederation from conceiving of the problems of federalism in terms that transcended the limited additional powers that Congress needed to respond to specific issues. Instead of contemplating the calling of a general convention, they pursued a prudent strategy of proposing discrete amendments whose piecemeal adoption and implementation, they hoped, would gradually make Americans less wary of a more efficient and potent national government. The desultory history of all the amendments that Congress had fruitlessly considered since 1781 indicated that more radical proposals stood little chance of adoption. Transcend the limited additional powers that Congress needed to respond to specific issues. Instead of contemplating calling a general convention, they pursued a prudent strategy of proposing discrete amendments. The desultory history of all the amendments that Congress had fruitlessly considered since 1781 indicated that more radical proposals stood little chance of adoption. Just as the movement for independence a decade earlier had tapped beliefs and attitudes far more profound than mere opposition to parliamentary taxation, so the political events of 1787 and 88 drew on deeper sources of concern than commerce, revenue, and Western lands. Important as they were, the principal national issues of the mid-1780s could never alone have generated the sense of crisis that gave the struggle over the Constitution its urgent tenor. For most Americans, indeed, national politics mattered little. They knew more about the debates in Parliament, which were reported in American newspapers, than about the deliberations of their peripatetic Congress, which still met behind closed doors, though in different towns until it finally settled in New York. When Americans thought about politics at all, they directed their concerns toward local and state issues. These were the levels of governance whose decisions affected their daily lives and which had to cope with the aftermath of a prolonged revolutionary struggle that had placed so enormous a strain on American society. How the states were responding to this task became, by 1787, as important an element in the movement for constitutional reform as the more conspicuous failings of Congress. When enlightened leaders like James Madison or Alexander Hamilton fretted about the general condition of the Republic, they increasingly worried less about the imbecility of Congress than about the shortcomings of the individual governments of the states. Yet while the manifest defects of the Confederation were few and conspicuous, the problems of state government were more complex and difficult to diagnose, nor was it evident how reforms at one level of government could benefit the other, insofar as most proposals to amend the Articles sought to free Congress from its debilitating dependence on the states. The agenda of national reform seemed designed to reduce rather than strengthen the connections between state and national politics. Directly and indirectly, perceptions of the problems of state politics and government influenced the movement for constitutional reform in three ways. First and most obvious involved those areas where Congress and the states remained necessarily bound together. The failure of the states to approve proposed amendments to the Articles, to meet the financial requisitions of Congress, and to abide by the provisions of the Treaty of Paris all called into question the fundamental premise of the Confederation, that the states would exercise their sovereign powers in good faith to fulfill rather than to frustrate essential national interests. The relation between national politics and a second set of problems of state governance was more elusive yet potentially more powerful. Complaints about both the quality of domestic legislation, that is, laws regulating the internal concerns of the states, and the contentious character of state politics suggested that the promise of the revolution was somehow being betrayed. Having won independence at great cost, Americans seemed unprepared or unable to manage their affairs wisely or peacefully. Much of this unease was a legacy of the final years of the Revolution, when inflation and its attendant evils strained both the resources of state governments and the public spiritedness of their citizens. In the years after 1783, many of the states moved quickly to retire their accrued public debt. Though their efforts were effective, by mid-decade, sorely pressed citizens were mounting increasing resistance to the collection of the requisite taxes. More worrisome than the impolicy of particular pieces of legislation, however, was the contentiousness of state politics in general. Discontent was directed against legislators and citizens alike, against both the mistakes of the lawmakers and the demands of their constituents. Office holders complained about the unreasonable expectations of the people at large, while voters faulted those whom they elected for failing to remedy their immediate grievances. This disillusion, too, could in part be traced to the closing years of the war, when revolutionaries at every level of politics repeatedly contrasted the prevailing quarrelsomeness and disaffection with the patriotic enthusiasm of 1774 to 1776. The memory of how unified Americans had been at the moment of independence was a nagging reminder of how far they had fallen during the short span of years since. All the complaints that state politics generated during the 1780s, it was far from apparent how the movement to amend the Confederation, even if it's successful, could simultaneously work to prevent the local mischiefs which everywhere excite disgusts against the state governments. Perhaps the most important consequences of this generalized discontent lay in the ambiguous realm of mood, attitude, and perception rather than in any specific set of proposals. As Madison observed soon after the convention, the evils issuing from the states contributed more to that uneasiness which produced the convention and prepared the public mind for a general reform than those which accrued to our national character and interest from the inadequacy of the Confederation to its immediate objects. By far the greatest influence that the experience of the states exerted on the deliberations of 1787 lay, however, in the area of constitutional theory itself. For when the framers set about designing the new national government, the crucial lessons they applied were drawn from their observation of the state constitutions written since independence. It was in the drafting of these charters, rather than the Articles of Confederation, that the revolutionaries had expressed their original notions of republican government most clearly. Some of these constitutions, notably Pennsylvania's, provoked controversy from the moment of their adoption. Others were drafted hastily by conventions and legislatures distracted by other duties. Others still, like the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, were approved only after prolonged debate and popular discussion. By the mid-1780s, however, all had come in for careful scrutiny and mounting criticism, as the experience of war and the dissatisfactions of peacetime generated complaints about the shortcomings of state government. Rather than treat these failings as merely a function of poor decisions or intractable difficulties, the critics of state government sought constitutional explanations for political problems. How the framers at the Federal Convention thought about such major theoretical issues as representation and the separation of powers was largely a response to their assessment of the relevant provisions and practices of the state constitutions. The states had served, in effect, as the great political laboratory upon whose experiments the framers of 1787 drew to revise the theory of republican government. That's fucking cool. All of these concerns ultimately influenced the debates at Philadelphia, liberating the convention intellectually and carrying its agenda well past the point where many delegates privately expected their explorations would end. Yet well into 1787, it seemed unlikely that the convention would range much beyond proposing remedies to the most familiar problems of the Confederation, or that if it did, its recommendations would do little more, as John Jay noted, than to approximate the public mind to changes which ought to take place. Such skepticism reflected the discouraging political obstacles against which those who favored reforming both the Confederation and the state constitutions struggled. The record was hardly encouraging. The states had taken more than 3 years to ratify the Articles. During the 6 years that had elapsed since, not one of the amendments that Congress proposed to the states was approved. The requirement of unanimous ratification seemed insurmountable. Nor was that the only problem. Article 8 required that amendments to the Confederation first be approved by Congress. But by 1785, its reputation had fallen so low that any proposal Congress submitted to the states seemed tainted at its source. Article 13, I'm sorry, not 8. Recognizing the force of these obstacles, the advocates of a stronger confederation favored a strategy of piecemeal reform, hoping that the adoption of one or more of the modest measures Congress had proposed would reduce the objections against further amendments. By the early spring of 1786, however, this posture of patient optimism had become difficult to maintain. Okay. Not only did the commercial amendments of 1784 remain unratified, but the revenue plan of April 1783 also seemed doomed to rejection. In March 1786, the New Jersey Assembly resolved that it would no longer comply with the financial requisitions of Congress. In April, the New York legislature nominally approved the revenue plan, but only with the conditions Congress deemed unacceptable because they conflicted with the corresponding acts already adopted by other states. With Congress clearly losing whatever influence it retained, the initiative for reform necessarily shifted to the states. The most important development took place in Virginia. In January 1786, at the very close of its session, the Virginia Assembly adopted a resolution calling for an interstate conference to consider the utility of vesting Congress with adequate power to regulate commerce. Far from being a bold expedient to force the pace of reform, this measure was a weak substitute for other proposals, more immediately favorable to Congress, that the Assembly balked at accepting. Thus, Madison supported the resolution because it was better than nothing, but for weeks after the legislature had adjourned, he thought that it was liable to objections and will probably miscarry. Yet Madison soon realized that no other measure appeared more promising. While James Monroe, writing from Congress, at first objected that the agenda of the conference was too confined to do much good, Madison reasoned that if anything can be done, it seems as likely to result from the proposed convention and more likely to result from the present crisis than from any other mode or time. Two considerations seemed crucial. First, amendments proposed by Congress stood little chance of approval. Nor was the Virginia Assembly, or any other, as yet prepared to empower its commissioners to go beyond the single issue of commerce. More comprehensive reform was desirable in theory, but political caution still demanded a step-by-step approach. Although 8 states eventually accepted the Virginia invitation to meet at Annapolis, only 12 delegates from 5 states appeared at the appointed time in mid-September. No proposal issued by this small group could be expected to carry any weight with the states or Congress. Yet to adjourn without doing anything would amount to conceding that the movement to strengthen the Union had reached a dead end. Instead, the commissioners chose a greater risk. Drawing on a clause in the instructions of the New Jersey members, they endorsed a report calling on the states to elect new delegates to attend a second convention, set for Philadelphia the following May, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Given the potentially radical thrust of this proposal, the Annapolis Convention has always had a conspiratorial aura about it. Writing to Jefferson a month before it met, Madison reported that many gentlemen, both within and without Congress, wished to make this meeting subservient to a plenipotentiary convention for amending the Confederation. The fact that those present at Annapolis included Madison, Hamilton, and John Dickinson, all prominent supporters of a more effective national government, suggests that the commissioners welcomed the opportunity to ignore their assigned agenda. Yet even if they did, none underestimated the task ahead. In fact, the Annapolis report was as much a desperate maneuver of politicians who had exhausted all other alternatives as a bold stratagem of statesmen who knew exactly what they wanted and how to get it. The sole advantage they could hope to exploit was that the failure of all previous measures to amend the Articles would finally rally the like-minded around the idea of a general convention. A measure that had long seemed too bold to have much chance for success. Yet this prospect alone could not miraculously overturn the obstacles that had blocked previous forays at amending the Articles, notably the requirement for unanimous ratification by the state legislatures, which might well oppose changes that would reduce their own powers. Beyond the realization that the strategy of gradual reform had collapsed, one further consideration probably spurred the Annapolis commissioners to gamble on a second convention. By the fall of 1786, it could no longer be safely assumed that time lay on the side of reform. Sectional rifts within Congress over commercial policy and the navigation of the Mississippi had exposed the fault lines along which the Union might divide should the national government fail to satisfy the rival interests of different states and regions. While the idea that the Union might devolve into regional confederacies still seemed incredible, events since 1783 had called into question the very idea of national interest. Even during the war, the transcendent issue of independence had not always stifled the expression of sectional antagonisms. In peace, it became entirely permissible to ask whether divergent regional interests could sustain the perpetual union the Articles proclaimed. In abandoning the strategy of piecemeal reform, the Annapolis Convention did not suggest that the mandate of the Philadelphia Convention should extend beyond the conspicuous failings of the Confederation to consider, as well, the internal problems of the states. By the early winter of 1787, however, events in Massachusetts had made it possible to cast the problems of the Republic in more comprehensive terms. Shays's Rebellion began as a protest movement among Massachusetts farmers laboring under the dual burdens of relatively heavy taxation and private debt. It escalated from a concerted effort to close county courts into a military confrontation pitting armed farmers from the interior against militia drawn largely from the seaboard counties. Although the government forces easily prevailed, that did not prevent concerned observers throughout the United States from taking alarm. Whatever else they thought about Massachusetts, its constitution was regarded as perhaps the best balanced of the revolutionary charters, and that was exactly why Shays's rebellion signaled a deeper crisis. If stable and seemingly well-governed Massachusetts could erupt in popular upheaval, what other state could claim to be more secure? From his distant vantage point in Paris, Jefferson dismissed Shays's rebellion with a characteristic aphorism. Quote, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing," he wrote Madison on January 30th, 1787, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Madison was hardly inclined to agree. Though reluctant to contradict his friend directly, he clearly felt that Jefferson, after 3 years in France, simply did not appreciate how grave the political situation at home had become. Madison allowed himself no such illusions. As he examined what he called the vices of the political system of the United States in the early months of 1787, he became convinced that the agenda of the coming convention could not be confined to the important but familiar problems of the Confederation alone. The time had come, Madison concluded, not only to free the Union from its dependence on the states, but to free the states from themselves by taking steps that would undo the damage done by the excesses of republicanism. Of all the developments that went into setting the agenda of the Federal Convention, James Madison's own preparations were perhaps the most important, and so deserve close attention in their own right. Okay. I think that's it for tonight. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining.